good evening, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So thank you, everybody, for coming out on this evening. We've got a very exciting program for you all. For those of you unfamiliar with myself, my name is George. I'm the programs manager here at the History Center. And we're very excited to have three esteemed members of the Military Miniature Society of Illinois for tonight's program, Miniatures at Attention. So a couple notices before we get started today. The program is going to consist of about a 20-minute presentation going over some of the general information of the society. Jim will be hosting that presentation. And then after that, I have some pre-made questions for our guest speakers tonight. And then after that, we'll kind of move into a questions and answers segment with everybody for the remainder of the program. The program is also being recorded, so you'll be able to watch a recording probably next week after it's exported. And if you register for tonight's program, you'll get a link to that recording. So you can share that with whoever you'd like, and you can also rewatch it free of charge. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest speakers for today. So starting off from the right and going to the left, we have Mr. Joe Berton. Joe is an Oak Park-based figure modeler and the current acting president of the Military Miniature Society of Illinois. Joe previously taught applied arts at First Julian Junior High in Oak Park and is the author of the acclaimed book T.E. Lawrence and the Arab Revolt, an Illustrated Guide. In addition to his work on T.E. Lawrence, Joe is an internationally recognized sculptor of miniatures, and his work, mostly of Middle Eastern subjects, has received numerous awards. Joe's first box diorama, titled Van Gogh's Bedroom, which is on display on the right over there, won a gold medal at the 2021 Chicago show hosted by the MMSI. Joe is a man with million stories and a rather famous alter ego among baseball fans. Moving on, we have Mr. Jim DeRogatis. Jim is a Chicago-based modeler and current secretary of the MMSI. Jim is the editor of the Society's quarterly journal, The Scabbard, and co-hosts the podcast Small Subjects with Barry Beediger. Jim has been a professional music critic and journalist for most of his career, and now teaches reviewing the arts, cultural criticism and the arts, among other courses, as an associate professor of instruction at Columbia College, Chicago. Jim spent 15 years as the pop music critic at the Chicago Sun-Times and continues to write about popular music and other topics for The New Yorker. Jim is also the co-host of the Sound Opinions talk show with Greg Kot, is that right? Heard on hundreds of public radio stations across the U.S. weekly and worldwide via podcast. Jim has written 11 books, most of them about music, but of particular interest to tonight's audience is the author of Shepherd Payne, The Life and Work of a Master Modeler and Military Historian. And of course, we have Herb Metzler back from our program in November. Herb is a miniature hobbyist, military historian, and longtime member of the MMSI. Herb also works on staff at the Art Institute of Chicago as a museum technician. Herb was instrumental in our Art of the Miniature exhibit as he performed extensive restorative work on a number of the miniature rooms on display, as well as generously lending History Center a number of miniature pieces from his personal collection. Herb was also a guest speaker at our November program titled A Conversation with Craftsmen, along Jay Kupchak and Madeline Crispell, which was held the day after our public unveiling of our Art of the Miniature exhibit, which will be up until April 1st. So after this program, you can go take a look in there if you haven't already. So with that, everything out of the way, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Jim DeRogatis.
Well, I gave a talk last year for the Hogan Library in Springfield, University of Illinois. One of their curators, one of their librarians, was a war game enthusiast. So they asked me to talk about the roots of this hobby, and I figured that those of you, we have a couple of MMSI folk here who know, obviously, where the hobby came from. But if you're just familiar with miniatures from, the Thornton rooms and the Kupchak work in this exhibit, I thought I'd tell you about where our end of it came from a little bit, and then we'll look at some of Joe's art and some of hers. Fine art miniatures really start with toy soldiers, right? Britton's, a company that's plastic toy soldiers, but that's where it comes from. The first toy soldiers are made of tin in the 1730s, and then in the 1880s in Germany there's a big surge of flat figures, one-dimensional, painted on one side, although often they're sculpted on two sides, so you can have them freestanding. These are about 1/60th scale, or 1¼ inch tall. Joe and Herb primarily work in 1/32nd scale, 54 millimeter. That's one of my boxes is 54, one of it's 75 millimeter, or 1/24 scale. The first serious book about treating toy soldiers, elevating them to another level, and painting them as fine art was the year he was born, 1964. Philip Stearns. Joe loved Philip. One of his sons is named after Philip. Philip is gone. Philip was a fascinating character. Art director, photographer, penthouse, as well as loving toy soldiers. In France, in the early 60s, the art form really takes off. You have artists like Roger Boudou and Josène Desfontaines painting these soldiers to a way higher level than the simplistic color of toy soldiers. And these figures now will sell, Joe, for several thousand, right? Again, 54 millimeters, so maybe a mounted figure is about 3.5, 4 inches tall, but standing alone, that figure is about 2.5 inches tall. Joe is a huge fan of Staden. In the 1970s, they begin to make, out of white metal, or pewter, basically, many finely sculpted 1/32nd scale figures, about 2¼ inches tall. The bigger ones, 90 millimeters tall, or 1/20th scale. But a lot of what we are doing, part of it comes from toy soldiers, and part of it comes from modeling, right? Circa World War I, balsa wood, airplanes, there's Jimmy Stewart, he was a big enthusiast. Herb and I won't speak for Joe, spent many hours sniffing the tester's tube and putting together plastic models, right? You used to be able to buy them at any Woolworths, at any drugstore. Not really fine art until the man we all called a friend and a mentor, Shepard Payne. Monogram models was based in Morton Grove for many years, and they made, which in the, for the 70s were pretty high standard detailed kits. Today, there might be 40 parts in a monogram model. Today you buy a model of that scale, of that size, 1/35th or 1/32nd. There's 300 pieces and photo etch detail and everything. Yeah, it's insane. Shep's innovation that brought the plastic model that you put on the shelf when it was done, or the kids I grew up with in Jersey City would stick a firecracker in it and blow it up. Taking that model and making it art was his innovation. Monogram saw his work at a local hobby shop and tapped him to set these models in realistic settings, dioramas of the sort that you would see in museums. We're familiar with natural history dioramas, real life scale, a taxidermy lion. If you go to the Museum of Science and Industry, you'll see Shep work on a model of John Paul Jones' flagship. What's it? Bonhomme Richard. And there's a submarine outside the submarine there that he is firing a nuclear missile. Shep wrote 4 books about elevating modeling or painting of toy soldiers to fine art. How to Build Dioramas in particular sold several 100,000 copies and is still in print today. Shep was really involved in the Military Miniature Society of Illinois. He wasn't one of the first members. It started back in 1952, toy soldier collectors. But when he joined, and Roy Anderson, a fine artist who enjoyed fine art was his career, enjoyed painting military miniatures, really brought everybody's game home. I wasn't here, but you were, Joe, and Herb, you were there soon after. Here are some of Shep's miniatures. You can see the level of detail. see some level of detail. Some of these he sculpted and painted. Some of these he just painted. You know, became more and more ambitious doing these vignettes, incredible animation, taking a plastic figure by a company named Hysterex and really making it, because they're very stiff and straight, making it into something else extraordinary. Joe never liked to whiff a grape shot at the top right, because he said it should have been called a horse's ass. I love that piece though, Joe. I disagree with you. You know, I first saw the picture of the Devastator at the Battle of Midway in Sports Illustrated, and it blew my mind and made me a huge fan. There's 3 box dioramas here tonight. We all know what a box diorama is. We all did one in grade school, right? There is your standard grade school table. Shep considered boxes the paradigm, the pinnacle of his art. And that's what he really became famous for. This is the gun deck of the Victory, which for years was in the collection of Malcolm Forbes. And it was on display at on the ground floor museum of the Forbes building in New York. A few of Shep's other boxes, the death of Jim Bowie, Lee at Appomattox. Grant is just barely visible if you crane your neck outside that door coming up the stairs to accept Lee's surrender. The turret of the Monitor, Napoleon at the tomb of Frederick the Great. The famous saying he said of Frederick was, if he was commander today, I would not have been victorious. Brady's studio, Lincoln sitting for photographer Brady. And Shep rarely copied other artists, but he wanted to see what the night watch would look like if it was 3-dimensional and not 2-dimensional as Rembrandt painted it. So that's kind of how we got here. This work by Shep is all from the 70s and 80s. Today, the level of sculpting and painting gets higher and higher and higher, and it's truly mind-blowing. None of us are quite at that level, but we have fun. So Joe's going to show you some of his pictures, and then Herb will show you some of his. I'll do a few of mine, and George wants to get to questions, so we love questions.
So I got involved in the hobby in the late 60s. I was just out of grade school, young years of high school, and I was fascinated of the hobby, seeing it in the magazine. Then I found out there was a hobby shop in Evanston called the Hobby Chest. Convinced my mom and dad to drive from St. Charles to the Hobby Chest in Evanston. There's no easy way to get to Evanston. No matter where you're at, even here, you can't get to Evanston easily. So my mom and dad said, well, you're in charge. I said, go to the lake, turn left, basically from St. Charles. And then I found out there's a group of people in the Chicago area that do this. And soon after that, I met Shep. I think I was still in high school when he was doing painting classes. So there were a number of us in that Chicago group, the Military Miniature Society of Illinois, that sort of advanced our game under the guidance and the mentorship of Shep. So I want to show you a few of my pieces, though many of us that do this do a lot of military subjects. I want to show you at least this one and then some civilian ones I do. George mentioned my interest in Lawrence of Arabia. I saw the movie when I was maybe 14. I was fascinated by the historical story and the camels and the rugs and all of it, the robes. So this is my piece. This is probably one of the more complicated ones I did, where I've got these camels in motion, the legs flying like pistons, the billowing robes. There's over 100 tassels on these saddlebags. The robes are made out of Kleenex coated with Elmer's glue. So we tend to use different materials that will work for what we wanted to do. Rather complicated. One entire camel is wired and attached to the center camel, so camels, like horses, will sometimes have every feet off of them. I do civilian subjects that interest me. In 2016, the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. I wanted to do a piece I could title Tinkers to Evers to Chance in salute of the famous Cubs shortstop, second baseman, first baseman double play group, with only featuring Evers. So I love that ballet bit of a guy coming in sliding hard at second with the second baseman or the shortstop, depending on which way the ball's coming from, leaping over. So I've got a research folder over there you can see where I've tried to find some photographs of that in action, and then posing my 20-some-year son in the different positions so I could work off of how the uniforms would fold and how his body would work if his legs kicked up. Thankfully, this year the Cubs won the championship. The next year they adopted pinstripes. So you know, some people might say, well, how do you do that? Avoid the hard stuff. I would have never attempted this with pinstripes. The interest in the Middle East, that led to a friend of mine doing a story for Sports Illustrated in the Gulf states. The Crown Prince of Bahrain and the photographer started talking about toy soldiers. The Crown Prince loved miniatures. Do you know anybody who wants to do something for me? My friend Lane Stewart said, well, you should talk to Joe. He loves doing Middle Eastern things. And they decided I would sculpt the chief falconer of the Crown Prince of Bahrain. So research is a big thing of what we do up here. I totally got engrossed with falconry and the different types of falcons. One of the leading experts on reintroducing falcons to the Gulf states was a guy from Cornell University. So Cornell was breeding falcons and such. So you learn all kinds of interesting things that never come up at Jeopardy.
So you now know about it. That the first piece of the opening slide of Napoleon at the Louvre, it took, I read a dozen books to determine which artworks Napoleon's armies looted as it crossed, Italy, and it was fascinating. And half of those pieces are in the Louvre still, and the other half had to get returned. But the box is in Joe's house because his wife, Gloria, is the curator of European art at the Art Institute. I figured, the Louvre, we ought to have it in Joe Burton's. Plus, I didn't have room for it.
It's in my house proud.
Yeah. Along with Joe's collection of 11 camel saddles that belong to
No, they're all different. It's sounding like glory. The camel saddles are each different. That's for another talk.
Hey, don't forget the round.
This piece, this is Ernest Hemingway on the right. I live in Oak Park. I've been fascinated by Hemingway. His friend is Robert Capa, the photographer. They met during the Spanish Civil War and renewed their friendship during World War II. This is during the advance to Paris to liberate the city from the Nazis. It's based on a photograph, a beautiful photograph of Capa on the left, Hemingway on the right, and in between is the Jeep driver. And I thought that would make a great duo if the Jeep driver was only taking the photograph. So I've eliminated the Jeep driver and figured out all the different uniform bits that these people would have. Capa jumped with the American parachutes unit at one time, so he's wearing U.S. paratrooper boots. Hemingway liked the old-fashioned U.S. Army boots. They're both American field jackets with different styles. So that was fun to research. So I've got that research folder over there too. Just to see the challenge as well, rather than buy books for photographs, I had one photograph to work on, and I wanted to see if I could actually research via the internet all the bits and pieces that I needed. So from the canteen to the boots and the field jackets and the Hasselblad camera that's around Capa's neck, all of that information I found via the internet. Monet painting at Giverny, he's actually did the miniature painting as well. That actual painting's at the Art Institute. The wife visited Giverny, and of course here there were tourists and they're taking pictures of all the bridges and that. I'm doing pictures of the little friends, the little land, the weeds and things offshore, and trying to figure out how do I do these in miniature. But that was a fun piece to do. Van Gogh coming off of a painting at Arles, trying to figure out what type of easel he would have for these outdoor excursions, the type of paint box he would have, another fun piece to do. This is the box I have over there. Jim mentioned my wife. Some of you probably know her, Gloria Groove. She's head of European Painting and Sculpture at the Art Institute. A show she did a few years ago was on Van Gogh's bedrooms, where she borrowed the Art Institute has one version of the three. The other is at the Versailles, and the final is at the Van Gogh Museum. So she brought all of those together, supplemented by different paintings that appear in the different versions. I've always wanted to do that, but that show that Gloria did gave me the incentive to figure it out.
You were supposed to finish it for the opening, and then you were going to bring it midway through, and then you were going to have it at the closing, then you finished it a year later.
You know, most of the time in the group I can just say whatever I like. You know,
Well, no, but this acting president thing, you're president for life.
He doesn't know that?
So
He doesn't know that. This is my job.
So the painting you know, and it's got this kind of odd distortion of that back wall. Well, in the 1920s, someone had the wisdom to do a blueprint of the Yellow House at Arles. And that's the actual room on the right, where it's a trapezoid room. It's not a rectangular shaped room, but that back wall actually goes away from you, the viewer. So that distortion, truly Van Gogh is just painting that wall as he sees it. I got a hold of the blueprint, scaled it down to the 1/32 scale I'd like to do, and that's my start of the shadow box there on the right. Now that I had the floor plan to do it, not just guessing what size it would be, I could actually do it in actual size, in miniature. So this is a couple of how-to shots. The wall behind the bed where he's got his painting smocks and straw hat. On the right, I'm starting to piece all these together. I painted the miniature paintings that would be on the wall as well. And eventually that's the piece. Now, I had to decide, do I go with how Van Gogh painted the room, or do I stick with historical fact? In the letters of Van Gogh, he's much more clear on how the floor looks, where it's tile. In the paintings, it almost looks like it's wood. I went with the historical tile. He talks about whitewashing the room prior to Gauguin's visit. I went with the white room instead of, as he paints it, he gives it a lilac, more peaceful quality for sleep, as he says, of peacefulness. So the room, and I love this little still life on the small table back there. That was a lot of fun to work with. Jim was my technical advisor because he helped me with the lighting. I find with a painting and sculpting, but electronics is not something I can master a flashlight and changing batteries.
Bob Wood was using a miniature itty-bitty booklight.
Right.
We did better than that.
So that gives you an idea anyway. And I was proud to show this to Douglas Drew, the former director of the Art Institute. He did a show on the Studio of the South with Van Gogh and Gauguin. And just to show him in actual miniature size and playing with the light, the only window in that room is actually that back window. So it's Van Gogh's taking what he sees and shifting it to maybe more what you would see in the Japanese prints that he favored, that silhouette of color, rather than reality of what he's seeing. And I was able to show the different lighting effects to Gloria and Douglas as well. They were amazed to see reality in miniature in a way, and how Van Gogh presented it on his final paintings.
Okay. So we're going to turn it over to Herb. You can,
Oh, okay.
there, you'll be able to see.
Which is the button? Right.
Yep.
I should point out, the Van Gogh bedroom, that was in the Studio of the South?
Yeah.
Okay. We should probably mention that the eclectic nature of our club, that the Studio of the South was destroyed in a bombing raid during World War II. We have another member in our club whose father was in the Air Force in the Second World War, and he inherited his father's photographs of their missions. They photographed their bombing runs. He's pretty certain that his father's airplane took out Van Gogh's studios.
That photograph is now at the Art Institute.
That made it to the show in time.
If you see,
That was research, that was part of the research, right?
if you see the painting Van Gogh does of the yellow house, the outside, looking at the yellow house with the shutters and things, you'll see a railroad track and steam come behind the house. That's what our American bombers were trying
Trying to get it right, yeah. We didn't have that
A
precision.
little footnote, you never thought you'd come to a miniature talk.
Yeah. I started way back sniffing blues. My sons now know. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
No, I would never. Back when I was probably the late 60s, and I came to it by way of modeling. And I was a big fan of Peanuts at the time, and Snoopy and the Red Baron. And I was like, and that's what pulled me into the military aspect. Was who is this Red Baron guy? And, you know, there was a figure, I think Cameo made a figure, and that's what got me interested in learning, switching from painting the airplanes to painting the figures. The kid comes as a clean-shaven man, and I wanted him to make much more like a Southern Cavalier. The 1st Virginia was very active at the beginning of the war, and I think Judge Stewart was in charge for the Black Horse Cavalry. But I added the mustache and the goatee based on photographs of the Confederate officers, and added the tassels based on an actual example of a hat that I found. Again, there's so much information online now.
You know, just to illustrate what I was saying earlier, the toy soldier version of this would have had 4 black colors.
Mm-hmm.
But look at what Herb's done to that white leather glove, right? I mean, it really seems three-dimensional because of the shade and the highlighting and the texturing. The white leather of the glove is different than the white uniform jacket, right? You know,
I'm going for a little shadow effect too, with the blue on the hair there under the tassel, and so. All right. This button here.
Yes.
Okay. There we go. This is another figure as a 28th Regiment of Foot, served in British North America during the French and Indian War. I was really drawn to this figure because it's like, oh, we can have fun with this, but just conveying the cold temperature, the discomfort. Again, why I'm fascinated by these subjects so much is like the hardships that these people put up with while wearing these exquisite costumes. This is a Berton's sharpshooters, 2nd USS sharpshooters. Again, research. There's any number of references out there that basically will tell you that Berton's was outfitted in green, which is a traditional color for rifle units in armies of the world beginning probably the late 18th century. But going online, I was able to find images of this particular uniform that is in the collections of the Smithsonian Institute. So if you look very careful at it, there's actually the shading between the tunic and the trousers and the kepi are all different. It's not just a uniform green, because a lot of these things were not uniform in spite of the term uniform.
Herb, I also want to point out your groundwork.
Yeah.
The different leaves and reeds
And this is something that has changed too since we started. It's become much more of a focus of the hobby, another level of artistry to bring to it, as well as the kinetic nature of, like, say, what you sculpt with the camels. Okay, a lot of the toy soldiers were static because that's the way they have to be molded. And so now we've been able to bring a lot more animation to these, what used to be a bunch of guys standing in line. Here's another bust of a Confederate drummer boy. You get to a certain point where you go, okay, I've painted that face, I'm very happy with the face. Do I add the freckles?
And screw it all up.
Screw it all up,
Rich.
right. It's like the pinstriping. Do I go that route now? Okay. I could have been very happy without the freckles, but I was pleased the way it turned out.
Hold it up.
And here's another This is the Company A, 9th Kentucky Infantry, also Confederate. I added the tie, but it's also a commercial figure. And this is a 2nd Missouri Cavalry, Merrill's horse, in the Union, in the Western Theater. That was a fun glove to paint too.
Yeah, that's great.
This is probably one of the nicest compliments I ever received. This is a figure that was sculpted many, many years ago by Mike Good, who is one of the most outstanding sculptors in our hobby. And it took me about 2 years just to get the shading on that, coming back to it, walking away from it, coming back to it, just to get the face the way that I wanted it. And I posted it on a website called Planet Figure, where a lot of us hang out from time to time. And I got a compliment from Mike Good, saying it looked better than his. And I was like, "Wow, that's very sweet. Thank you." And then,
And Herb has a display case inside of his pieces. That you can see, yeah. Joe's over there.
Shameless plug.
All right, real quick, so we can get to questions. This is a Lancaster bombing Berlin late in the war, 1945. Late in the war, because I didn't want to try the challenge of flak bursts. This is when Germany's already losing. I brought this to the Plastic Model International Plastic Model Society convention in Omaha, right? They're a big gathering. And those guys in the hobby are not nearly as much into storytelling as we are. The derivative term is rivet counters. It's got to be exactly precise. This blew their mind. And my favorite photograph that a buddy of mine captured was, they look with magnifying glasses and flashlights and see, did you have the right number of rivets on the wing of that plane? This guy was shining a flashlight inside my box diorama. It's like, the whole point was the lighting. Storytelling, I read about a dozen books. In Napoleon's campaign in the 1790s in Italy, where he's fighting the Germans, the Hussars, the light cavalry, the most dashing of the troops. If you've ever seen the Ridley Scott film, The Duelists, fantastic depiction of them, were stabling their horses in this disused dining hall in Milan of a refectory of a monastery. Da Vinci had painted the Last Supper in the monks' dining hall. The monks were grieved that their supper was coming cold, so not long after the painting was finished, they cut off Christ's feet and put a door there so the food would come quicker. And within 15 years of Da Vinci painting this, everybody had forgotten and did not care, to the point where the horses were being stabled there. Napoleon's nephew and one of his most talented commanders was in charge of the Hussars and came to inspect them and said, better call father-in-law. I think this painting might be worth something. And Napoleon had a copy made that hangs in the Louvre to this day and kicked out the horses. Preservation began. We bombed it in World War II, but the monks had lined sandbags. Every wall and the ceiling, the entire monastery was gone except for the wall. And now they just finished a couple of years ago restoring it painstakingly. Da Vinci, it's not a fresco. Da Vinci painted oil on plaster, which is one reason why it was so fragile. If you go to Milan today, you got to get tickets 2 or 3 weeks in advance. You got to go through this hyperbaric chamber. You get 10 minutes in front of and then you go to the hyperbaric chamber on the way out. It's a big pain in the ass. I didn't go. But there was a World Expo. Every 3 years, somewhere in Europe or the United States, modelers from around the world gathered basically for their Olympics. And this one was just north of Milan. And I figured, well, I grew up across the river from Manhattan. Go to Statue of Liberty all the time. Go to Ellis Island, right? I figured every grade school kid who would come to this exhibit would have gone to see the Last Supper. And I was rewarded with Boy Scout troops. I got pictures of Boy Scout. I got a picture of 5 nuns, oohing and ahhing, Italian nuns. I didn't get any awards, but I did the moon landing, which So, you know, the joy of a box diorama, they don't photograph well because you can look at those we brought, and the fun is to crane your neck and see what's in the nooks and crannies. So somewhere in there is, well, Abby Hoffman you can see. You can't see the girl in the yellow dress from the famous film, sort of, she's obscure. Allen Ginsberg is in there. We got a lot of Chicago cops. Pegasus. The Yippies were running a pig for president. The pig was arrested, and you can see him in there. I had a lot of fun with it. Nobody got that either. None of the Europeans knew the history, but I was happy with that. So we talked about this. I run a website called boxdioramas.com. We've got about 4 or 5 dozen artists who specialize in this. We have a website for the MMSI, and George can put the links up for that. We have the free journal, and we have a podcast. And George, you were eager to get your questions.
So, but before questions, there's a clipboard. How often have you seen a clipboard these days? There's a clipboard over there. If you want to become a member of the MMSI, all we need is your name and email address.
Email address.
And
It's free.
you will get Jim's electronic version 4 times a year of our publication, The Scabbard. We used to have, in the old days, 120 active physical members. With Jim's help going worldwide now, we have 851 electronic members.
854.
854. We've got
All of it.
They're signing up now.
No, I said 854.
Okay. So please, if you'd like to hear more about us, you'll get the historical soldier journal, miniature journal, and also word about our annual show we do in October over at Shaw. Okay, now it's time for questions.
George was eager.
Very good. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for that introduction. Through the PowerPoint, it was great to be able to see all of your work and the differentiations between your work and your stylings. So I have a couple preloaded questions here. Maybe I'll do 1 or 2 for each of you, and then I'd love to be able to get our audience involved for the remainder of the program. So, Herb, I wanted to start with you. First of all, welcome back to the History Center. Herb was here in November of last year on a panel with Madeline Crispell, who was our guest curator, and Jay Kupchak of Kupchak Studios was here for that program as well. And Herb, you brought a unique perspective because you have not only some of your personal collection on display here at the History Center, but you also did a lot of renovation work for some of the throne rooms that we have on display here. And when we talked about it in November, the exhibit had just opened. But over the course of the past 4 months, one of the biggest questions that we get people walking in is, how does one person have this much time and dedication to put all this detail into one of these pieces, specifically with your pieces? But what I wanted to ask you is, when you were working on those renovated dorm rooms,
Right.
how does your research approach change based on whether you were working on a personal piece, but now you're working on recreating a room that someone else did? What goes into the research of that?
Basically, let's put it in slang, you learn how to read the room. Whoever built that room to begin with, and in this case, I think they were mostly Mrs. Thorne herself. They were her constructions as opposed to the Kupchak work that she had commissioned that are the forelings of the Art Institute. These were things that she made for charity auctions, to be sold to raise money for charity auctions. And she worked with a combination of things that were, you could tell, were commercially available pieces and things that she made herself, or she fabricated herself. But because I've been tasked with restoring things that are broken, things that are, need to be re-glued, or we have to figure out where they go and slight repairs made. Where the glue, adhesive, things like that, they tell you where things belong, and you can start, sort of sort out the broken pieces and begin to get a basic assembly. And then the rest is, I just have to trust my imagination at this point to fit with hers. With the bar scene, I was looking at it, it was so rigidly symmetrical, and it just suggested to me that if she's doing research that I would, you know, and I think this is exactly the same thing, she comes from the same point of view, she does the research. It suggested to me that God, I'm blanking now, I think it's a red water painting. I work at the Art Institute. Manet, thank you. Works at the Art Institute, right. The Manet painting and of the woman standing behind the bar, and that gave me a clue. There was an empty fruit dish, and it had just a bunch of glue residue, and I found a few, let's say, proof that animals had been inside this box at some point. So it's like, oh, that's why there's no fruit in the fruit bowl. She used something that they made off with. And so that painting gave me the idea to replace it with the oranges. And I just thought that would be true to the spirit. It would be my own little touch, but it still would be true to the spirit of her creation.
So, Jim, when you were giving your presentation, you had talked about the history of the miniature field and how it evolved from molded pieces into these much more dynamic pieces. Something that we touched on back in November briefly was the influx of new technology moving into the miniature making field, specifically things like 3D printers or glow forges or things that kind of take the parts of miniature making that are very tedious and have kind of taken advantage of that and made them much more accessible, faster to produce, things like that. How has that technology permeated into the military miniature society? Have you seen a lot of those adaptations time to take effect?
We're beginning to see a lot of 3D printed busts and figures, mostly in the fantasy realm. A lot of naked women with swords and shields. You know, it's a tool. It's another tool, and I can understand how armor modelers and airplane modelers, you know, the tedium of track wheels. You know, you can print one, and then you can make 3 dozen of them. It's a different skill. I mean, I enjoy sitting with the sculpting and the painting and the carving and the chopping off of my fingertip with an X-Acto. Reasonably, yeah. That's what super glue is for. Initially a battlefield adhesive.
That's right.
You know, I want to get away from the damn computer. So, you know, step one in 3D printing is designing on the computer. And, you know, no thanks. But it does have, you know, my buddy Barry in Utah, who I do the podcast with, I needed a really tiny toy garbage truck for a 1/24th 75 millimeter scale, you know, and I said, can you do this? And he found a file on the net and he printed 6, you know, in varying scales. Here, boom, no problem. Now, it ain't quite that easy. It takes about 10 hours to print something, you know, on a 3D printer. But it's getting better all the time. I don't know, you know. It's a tool.
I want to add something to that.
Yeah.
We had the cup checks out to one of our meetings maybe 15, 20 years ago.
No, it was like 10
You were there?
I was there, yeah.
Does that count the COVID years?
Yeah. They've been twice.
And the question was asked about glues and resins. I mean, resins are relatively new to the hobby. We've had people that have bought toy soldier bags of resin figures, only to see them over a decade start to distort and still chemically change. The cup checks would only do things that have been time tested for generations, much like wood ship modelers. They want their pieces to last for generations. We tend to want them to last for the next exhibition.
Yeah.
So
through the weekend.
So some things like I'm doing with Kleenex and Elmer's glue, that hasn't been time tested. Cutting sheets of typing paper and coating with Elmer's glue for horses' reins, that hasn't been time tested. Now some of those pieces are 40 years old, and the reins are like thin, brittle glass. If I hit them with a brush, they just shatter. So some of it, you can take benefit with the new technology, but we also have to pay attention if we do want these to last. One of them was saying, well, what about that, you know, the candelabras in there, or the candlesticks, they're beautiful. And I think it was Jay said, well, I do the master, then I take it down to the jeweler and he casts it in silver.
Yeah, no, they did not.
We just want it to look right.
They did not use
cast it.
plastic painted
Right,
to look
right.
like silver. They cast it. 4 of Shep's pieces were brought by the great artist Andrew Wyatt, boxes, and I had the privilege of leading a team of us geeks to Chad's Ford, the museum, and Wyatt actually kept them in his studio. Right, nobody was allowed in the studio, even Betsy, his wife. He kept them there because he loved them as art, you know, this great artist. And the lights had gone, and we, you know, had to fix up things, and I put in LEDs, which last hundreds of thousands of hours, as opposed to Shep was using automotive light bulbs, like that you put in your tail light, because that was what was available when he did it. And we found weird things. There were certain, you know, like blue oil paint on
The
his
epoxy,
sculptures.
the epoxy or the sculpting medium we would use,
Yeah.
for some reason, the dark blues would respond to that, and it would get a frosted look. So, but we never had the 30 years in between to see that.
He didn't think it was going to last 40 years, you know, and be in Andrew Wyatt's museum. So we fixed it all up, and that was joyous.
Well, they lasted longer. They lasted longer than Da Vinci. That was getting messed up.
Within 10, 15 years,
Right.
you know.
If I can just add one thing, I do know now that for kits, for example, they've started selling you the files instead of the kit. So if you can print it out at home, you can just buy a file.
Joe, I wanted to ask, going back to the annual exhibition that the MMSI puts on annually, the Chicago show, that is one of the biggest programs that I would say, talking to you as the current president of the MMSI, one of the biggest ways for any person, regardless of their interest or knowledge base in miniatures, can come by and view the exhibition. Could you tell us a little bit about what that exhibition is, how it's put together, and then how you approach the scores and evaluations of that exhibition? And can anyone come in and join that exhibition?
Right, it's typically a show that starts on a Friday afternoon through about 8 at night, and then all day Saturday. And we draw close to 200 artists that would display their work, ranging from beginners to professional types. And it's primarily, I like to say it's an exhibition.
It's a juried exhibition.
It's an exhibition for people to share their work. We do give awards. Many people like to have the quality of their work judged by their peers. So Jim is the head judge. He assembles an international group of modelers that are familiar with techniques in sculpting and painting. So that if you're building tanks or that feature, you would have experts in that field judging that work. So that's part of the exhibition itself. For the public to come in, you will see some of the best work being done today. You will also have vendors there selling kits, selling research materials, selling tools to the finest paintbrushes and files. So I always encourage people to come. If they don't know much about the hobby, it's such a wonderful place to experience it, because you can kind of see how it's done with the vendor selling the material and see the results with really the best artists in the world displaying the recent productions. So it's a great opportunity to come and see what we're all about.
If I can just add to that, it's, even though it's not a World Expo, it's our annual Chicago show, we draw exhibitors from Australia, Sweden, Malta, who come every year to this show. And, you know, people like yourselves who travel to Europe to go and just, you know, for various shows. So it's an international hobby.
We're going to the show in Europe, but we're telling our wives it's a vacation. It just happens to be, you know, and days, we gotta be here.
Right.
But what happens, that gathering, like any similar convention of likes, you have the opportunity to enter into dialogue with people that share your hobby and interests. And we offer seminars as well, so you can learn from some of the best. But I think as those of us that participate, one of the best benefits for us is to meet other people that share the hobby, what techniques they might be doing, talk about projects they've got in mind, learn techniques that they may have mastered that you're trying to do yourself. So for anyone who shows up, there's whole different degrees of benefits, but it's fantastic. And now we're 40-some years, I think we've been doing this, right?
This year, 48.
48. COVID threw us off there. About to be 50 soon.
Is NFC having their 80th? Did I see that? They're having their 80th. Oh, 40th.
No, so yeah.
NFC, yeah.
No, they are.
They're ahead of us.
I thought I just saw the flyer.
No, they started in this. We were going to that show before we had a show.
Yeah. That's what I saw, a whiff of grape shot.
No, you weren't born yet.
So I'll do one more for all of you to get your thoughts on this, and then I'll turn it over to our audience for the remainder of the program. The biggest question, besides the one that we talked about, Herb, having to do with the detail that goes into all of these, is, gosh, there's no way that I would have the patience or time or dedication to do any of this by myself, on my own free will. And so, as members of the society and as miniaturist hobbyists who all have their different roots about how you got into this field, for everyone here who may not be too familiar or too comfortable with the miniature field, maybe they've seen them, maybe they enjoy looking at them, but they could never imagine dipping their toe in the water and trying to do a project themselves. So for everyone here who's not so familiar, and for everyone watching on the recording, what would you say is the best way to get involved with the field past just appreciating the work and actually trying it yourself? What are some of the misconceptions that you would dispel having to do with needing immense patience or time or dedication?
Well, I think you've got to have the interest and drive, and the curiosity of how to do it. And I think if you've got the curiosity and fascination with it, that enthusiasm will take you to different layers of success as you progress and get better. So and some of that had happened when we saw magazines, when we saw some people's work. Man, how did he do that? So, and each of you probably have that field that it could be golf or whatever, but you've got an attraction to some interest that you're drawn into. There's much better resource materials now. There's YouTube videos of how to do it. If you want to get into the pool, it's a lot easier to dive in even to the deep end now than it was when some of us got started. So I'd encourage people to look at materials that are available. Come to the show and see what you like, and then you can learn to try and emulate what you'd like to master.
You know, the entry point now, George, for many young people is the Warhammer figures, about 30 millimeters tall. And that comes out of trading cards that I don't understand the culture of, and Dungeons and Dragons style role-playing games that I don't understand either, right? But there are while the sort of hobby shops we all grew up in are mainly gone, these Warhammer shops are still around and thriving. And so, and those figures are cheap and imaginative. Some of them are little tiny half-naked women with swords, and some of them are orcs, big on orcs, they're big on orcs, and a lot of orcs. And
But Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings and
the dragons and all that.
yeah, you can come home for $10 with a basic paint set and 3 or 4 of these figures in your pocket, and a lot of kids are starting with that. And you know, I think a lot of adults, you know, they want a little slightly bigger, but you know, the plastic and resin figures are cheap, and it doesn't cost a lot to get started. And your first 100 suck, like everything else, you know. And then if you're enjoying it, today, with so much time in front of the computer and so much virtual reality, that to sit there and work on something that is 3D with your hands is enormously satisfying.
It's the question of passion. I mean, I don't understand how people have patience, dedication, energy, and stamina and willpower to go to a gym and sculpt their bodies. God! This is a lot less stressful and a lot more absorbing. I don't have, I can listen to music, I can watch news, just like I would at the gym. And there's not a lot of sweat equity, it's just time and effort. But it's if you're really interested, you'll keep at it. I shouldn't say that because there is a level of frustration here. You want it to look as good as what you see. And James Rice had a seminar at our last show. And I thought he said something really interesting. He said, the trick is learning to live with the fact that it will look terrible until you get it to look the way you want it to look. And that's true of just about anything that really is your heart's desire. It's the process. And that's all there is to it. This is my passion. This is our passion.
You mind if I throw something in? I'm doing this only because in the members of our club that are actively producing, despite the color of my beard, I'm probably the youngest one. I only started painting 5 years ago.
God damn it.
And the reason I did was I went to the show and I'm very impressed, and I'm walking around the vendors' tables, and these guys have these, we're calling them stock kits laid out, and I'm looking at one I really admire, and the guy goes, "Why don't you buy it?" And I said, "Because I don't paint." And he said, "Why don't you paint?" And I said, "Because I can't." He goes, "How do you know you can't?" And I thought about that for a minute, and mostly out of shame and humiliation, I bought it. but I did sit, then I bought a set of paints, and I bought a set of brushes, and there's a little bit of an investment, but it's not prohibitive. And the truth is, I was really surprised, having listened to some people about how to paint more seriously, and I was no art kid. It wasn't as hard as it looked. When you see the work that's been projected by this august panel, these guys are gold level painters. I'm way down on the table of elements chart from gold, but try it. It's fun, and like Herb said, you have a ball game on in the background, and it's not very stressful. And to get the basics down is not as hard as it looks. And after that, you push yourself as hard as you want to go.
And I'd like to make a point, kind of go along with what was being said earlier. People are just getting started. If you go to the show, one of the things is the people there are approachable. You can ask people, "How did you do that?" And nearly everyone is going to tell you how they did it. It's not like it's some arcane secret. "Oh no, I can't let you know how I did that because then you'll do it." People will share their knowledge very readily within the hobby.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to learn a lot if you just ask.
As I said, those books that Shep wrote are still the Bible. I mean, some of the techniques are different today, but he was never, despite selling his work to the likes of Malcolm Ford and Andrew Wyatt, he was never proprietary about it. He was happy to share it, and I think that's, I think the model railroad world is the same way. A couple of hobby areas are like that. There's a lot of podcasts out there now, not so much for our end of the hobby. YouTube channels, videos, and podcasts about the plastic end. That's why Barry wanted to start one that was about our end. So, and now we have a crossover our next episode. We interviewed this Norwegian woman who is sort of doing what Cupjet did, except with mice. And she's got a wicked, dark sense of humor. The mice are characters in David Lynch movies and The Exorcist and stuff. And so she's doing box dioramas of these scenes from. She also does nude modeling. Maybe that's why we wanted to talk to her. And she's a costume designer for Norwegian cinema. So go figure, right? I mean, there's esoteric people. One of the things that's nice about the MMSI is, Bob Sarnowski, the gold level painter, kept the printing presses running in the doctors. We have a lot of lawyers. And we have Pat drove a tank in Iraq. You know,
And John Rosengrant, who was.
John Rosengrant is
Sheriff
Baby
of Wars.
Yoda.
He is the man behind Baby Yoda.
He was father of Baby Yoda, yes.
And the Terminator.
And the Terminator, Alien, Predator, yeah.
I think Guillermo del Toro was also a painter.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings had a model company
Right.
that really detailed World War I planes.
You need
And
a wide variety
getting
of
set up
different
from,
people.
getting set up from scratch is cheaper than a decent set of golf clubs.
Yeah.
A lot less frustrating.
Yeah, that's true. And a better quality of people.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I'd love to turn it over to our audience now. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll run over with the microphone. So do we have any questions for our panelists at the moment?
So for the piece that's over on display here, I was just kind of curious how long it takes to sculpt and paint and prepare that. I mean, the amount of detail is just incredible. I'm wondering if you could just speak to that real quick.
That was probably 4 or 5 months, half a year, something like that. I wanted to see how my skills had improved, so I was using a lot of those white plastic Hysterex pieces that I started out with, you know, and that Shep did those the whiff of grape shot and other things. So it didn't take as much time as you might think, because only 2 or 3 of those figures are sculpted. And when we say sculpted, we may have a torso and a pelvis, and they're connected with paperclip wire, and the rest is putty. Some people sculpt their own heads, really ambitious. My buddy Barry sculpted the head of that punk rocker. And others use pre-sculpted heads that we buy, and you know, as Herb added the mustache to the bust, or the change in hairstyle, or added the tie, we convert them to our needs. I'm always making my people fatter. I don't know why. Except the women. I tend to, because I swear, the proportions, especially the fantasy world, right, George? I was like, there are no human beings that look like that.
Well,
you
it
know?
depends on which sculptures you're talking about.
I'm talking about the naked ladies with swords.
Again, there's a huge range in terms of proportionate accuracy in sculpting.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe about 6 months on one of these boxes.
That's in addition to the day job.
It's what keeps me sane from the day job.
Day jobs.
Day jobs.
Day
yeah.
jobs, yeah.
Yeah, between teaching and yeah.
But Jim, does that also include all of the research that you put into that? I mean, building it is one thing, but research.
I'm a voracious reader, you know, Tony, so step number 1 is buying the 10 books on Amazon, you know, and I just read for 2 hours every night. And one of the most fun things, you know, I'm not a huge World War II buff, but when I was doing the Lancaster, I was reading all about the air war in Britain, the difference between the air war and the way the Americans waged it, the way the British waged it, you know, and it's like 1 out of 10 of those crews came back. I mean, it was horrible, right? You know, and so it's fascinating. You're immersing yourself in that period for the 6 months simultaneously.
And the research is quite often going on anyway. Like I want to do something with Gandhi, I want to do something with Hamilton and Burr, and I want to do something with Gauguin. Not all together at a dinner.
Yeah.
But so as I'm researching, I kind of got those kind of stewing to figure out in my own head what those ideas might be.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Do you ever have anything that you start doing that you decide you just don't want to do? And you quit?
I have any number of projects in any various stages of completion. And I might start it and I just either get to a point where I go, I've set myself a challenge I don't feel up to at the minute, or I find something else that comes along that takes my attention away from it. So, and again, it's not, while you have one thing in various stages of completion, it's nice to focus then on something else. So you're not waiting for something to dry or something to, you know, inspire you or do something different. So I have a lot of things in, as I said, all over the place.
Our buddy Mike, who was president for life before Joe became president for life, he passed not long ago. When we were cleaning out his workbench, they were literally pieces that had gotten cobwebs on them that he'd started, and they sat there that long. I start something and I finish it. I'm just stubborn that way.
I've told people, if you're too hung up on it, put it aside and start on something new. Go back to it. The world is full of artists. We all die with stuff in our studio. You know, if you're at the museum, you might put it on the wall. But I was arguing with Gloria, but he thought it wasn't finished. Can't you put a footnote on that? The guy's still working on it.
Didn't want to show it.
They didn't want to show it, but you've got it. So.
On the other hand, Vivian Meyer died without anybody seeing her pictures.
Right.
And now, you know, considered right up there with, you know, many of the greats of photography.
And so I think we've all got things in the, we put aside or revisited at a later date. I was doing a Lindbergh landing in Paris on the shoulders of two Frenchmen. They had 100,000 people there when his airplane touched down. Incredible. And I saw a quick painting of celebrating that, and I started sculpting it, and it just wasn't working. I just couldn't master the weight shift and all that. And I revisited it, could have been 10 years later, put that aside, started it again, and was rather pleased with how it finally turned out. It just was not an idea ready at the time on that first go around.
What's the most popular historic period in military pictures? The Napoleonic era, Civil War, which is very broad.
Goddamn Fairmont.
There's a lot of Nazis.
You know, Napoleon would be,
Napoleonic,
the uniform.
Napoleonic, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, in the 60s and 70s, there was this kind of like sophisticated smoking jacket ascot scene in some ends of the hobby that were fascinating with Napoleonics, right? And, but I think overall, you know, it's not a celebration of that period. Chef Payne always said, the German uniforms and vehicles look cool. And they did. They were put to sad use, obviously. Yeah, it's World War II, but fantasy is coming up strong among younger. You know, some of the best painters today, Spain, Italy, France, are just obsessed with fantasy. And they're getting past orcs and inventing their own, sculpting their own fantastic creations. And that's really where, you know, none of us, you know, it's nice that you guys said we're gold level. None of us are at the level of those painters today. That's why at World Expo.
If I can just ride on that, the hobby with the fantasy and the sci-fi, the hobby is attracting. We came from the background where it was about the historical accuracy and the research and trying to recreate that in miniature. The fantasy and the sci-fi is bringing in artistry. I mean, people who are, not that we haven't had genuine artists in the hobby before, but it's bringing in people who are exploring light and color and a palette where they're not limited by historical accuracy. They can give full range to an imagination that, you know, we might have trouble connecting with sometimes, but they have, the focus is shifted somewhat because they're, especially the artistry that I see on display now, they're doing these dynamic effects with lighting is where was their approach to the hobby. And it's really a fascinating way to relook and to try to borrow those techniques and bring that into what we do. And that's another level of looking at things. rather than just from the theory of recreating a historical color palette.
And in the time frame, though, it's taken them about a generation to discover their own imagination.
Yeah.
Instead of just relying on the Frank Frazettas of the world, or the book cover type of illustrations. And when you aren't limited to historical accuracy, like Herb said, the best of those science fiction fantasy modelers, it's their own imagination that they can run with. Yeah. And the work they're doing now is superb. It really is.
I'd like to say thank you very much for bringing your exhibits. They were absolutely fascinating, and I'd like to give you a round of applause.
Any other questions?
There's cookies over there, huh? We asked about cocktails, but,
Yeah, that fell on deaf ears.
We'll do one more, and then I'll make a concluding statement.
I've got one thing I'd like to add. It occurred to me today, coming up here, that today is Groundhog Day. And the very famous movie, Bill Murray and Andy McDowell. I worked years ago with Danny Rubin, who was the screenwriter for that movie. And I haven't seen the movie since it first came out, but I caught up with Danny Rubin about 10 years ago, and over drinks, he goes, did you catch the reference to the figure painter in that movie? And I said, you got me, Danny, it's been a while since I've seen it, I don't recall. He goes, yeah, it was a passing reference to somebody who's a figure painter. I remembered that was your hobby, and I was looking for a detail about this character, so. Our hobby is in Groundhog. Made it big time. Made it big time.
Usually the figure painters, they're sort of closet assassins.
That's right. Next slide.
I wanted to do a whole.
the 40-year-old virgin, Steve Carell.
The West Wing or something, just.
Oh, yeah, the evil West Wing.
House of Cards.
House of Cards, yeah. So usually if it's a figure painter, they're evil. They're not mainstream.
Max Van Sydow, 3 Days of the Condor.
Right.
There's Ronan, isn't there, a guy who's a painter, Ronan?
Well, you can tell Wes Anderson's into it, because of the detail of the Tannenbaum's house and the ship, what's the, Steve Zissou, yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah, he's got that.
And the Tim Burton stuff.
And Berton is very close, and Guillermo del Toro
Yeah.
is doing that. This Pinocchio is very similar to what we're doing.
Come up and take a look at the stuff. Herb's things back there, and there's some publications over
George
there.
had a statement he wanted to make. You're stepping on George!
Do we have any other questions, final questions? Okay, well, very good. So I'd like to thank our presenters for this evening's presentation. I just want to say a couple words before we adjourn for the evening. I wanted to say, of course, we have the MMSI sign-up sheet over there, as well as some other things to take a look at. We have some miniature displays out here in the main hall, and then we also have our Art of the Miniature exhibit on the other side of the building to take a look at. We'll probably be open for another 20, 25, 30 minutes, something like that, so please feel free to peruse around. I also wanted to mention that programs like these are free because of the continued support of our membership base here at the History Center. And so if you aren't a member, there's plenty of ways to get involved here at the History Center. We have a couple board members here who would love to talk to you about the benefits of membership at the History Center, one of which being, and it connects to this program here, we'll be doing a members-only exclusive tour of the Art Institute of Chicago with Eleanor Alcorn, who is one of the heads of curation over at the Art Institute, as well as Research Associate Kate Heller. That'll be on March 3rd, and it's exclusively for History Center members. And so that's a way for us to give back to our membership, because they allow programs like these fantastic programs with great guest speakers to be able to be free and open to the public at any time. So once again, thanks again to all our members for their continued support, and thank you to all three of our wonderful guest presenters for this night's presentation. So thank you.